3 weeks before my son's retirement celebration dinner, the woman who'd cleaned my house for 18 years pulled me into her car and locked the doors. "Margaret," she said. She always called me Margaret, never Mrs. Onthak. "Harlow, even after all this time, Margaret, I need you to listen to me before we go inside." Her hands were shaking. Edna never shook. Edna was the kind of woman who calmly swept broken glass off my kitchen floor the morning after Thomas's funeral, while I sat at the table unable to move. Seeing her hands tremble was like watching the ground crack open. "I'm listening," I said. She looked at the front window of my house. "He was here last night. Your son-in-law. He came in through the back, the way he always does, and he didn't know I was still there finishing the laundry." She paused. "He was on the phone." She turned to look at me directly. "Margaret, he knows about the Harlow account, the real one, the one you never told anyone about." I felt something go cold in my chest. The Harlow account was a private investment fund my husband Walter had set up in 1991, 2 years after we founded Harlow Property Group. It wasn't secret in any illegal sense. It was simply ours. A trust designed to pass cleanly to our children after we were both gone. Valued now at just under $4 million, separate from the company, separate from everything else. Walter had been careful that way. He'd always said, "Keep something back." Not out of selfishness, out of wisdom. My son-in-law's name was Craig Whitfield. He'd married my daughter Claire 11 years ago in our backyard under the oak tree Walter planted the year she was born. He was a financial consultant, polished, educated, the kind of man who always knew the right thing to say at the right moment. "What exactly did you hear?" I asked Edna. She reached into her sweater pocket and pulled out her phone. She'd recorded it. 34 seconds. Craig's voice, low and clear. "The account clears to the trust when she dies or is declared incompetent. We don't need to wait for either. We need Dr. Previtt to file his assessment. Once that goes through, Claire becomes sole administrator. You move the $4 million into the Whitfield holding structure before anyone checks the filing. It has to be done before the dinner. That's the window." I sat in Edna's car in my own driveway and listened to that recording twice. Then I said, "Thank you for telling me." She started to cry. "I'm sorry I didn't come to you sooner. I wasn't sure what I was hearing. I thought maybe I misunderstood." "You didn't misunderstand," I said. I reached over and held her hand for a moment. Then I looked at my house, the front flower beds I'd planted myself 30 years ago, the blue shutters Walter had painted the summer before he got sick, the wreath on the door that Claire had hung there for Christmas last year and hugged me afterward and said, "Mom, it looks perfect." I had 4 days. That was a Tuesday, my son's retirement dinner. My son James, who had nothing to do with any of this, who lived in Oregon and called every Sunday and had no idea what was happening in his mother's house, was Saturday evening. I went inside and I made a cup of coffee and I sat at the kitchen table and I thought about Walter. He died in 2016. Pancreatic cancer. We had 8 months from diagnosis. He spent most of them working, not because he didn't want to be with me, but because working was how Walter showed love. He renegotiated our property leases, updated our estate documents, called our accountant and our attorney separately on the same afternoon. He left everything as clean as he possibly could. A man who spent 40 years building something doesn't stop building just because he's dying. After he was gone, I ran Harlow Property Group alone. We had 12 commercial properties in the Charlotte metro area. I was 62. Everyone told me to sell. I didn't. I hired a property manager, kept the relationships Walter had built, made every decision the way he would have made it, carefully, slowly, with a lot of coffee and a lot of questions. By 2021, the company was valued at $9 million, not because of any genius on my part, because Walter had built something solid and I had refused to let it fall. Craig had come into our lives looking like the kind of man who builds solid things. He joined Claire's life at 34, a VP at a regional wealth management firm, articulate and calm. He and I had always gotten along. He called me Margaret. He asked about Walter on holidays. He remembered things I told him. I didn't see anything wrong. Looking back, I can trace it. Small things. Claire stopped calling as often in 2022. When she did call, she sounded measured, careful, like she was reading from notes. Craig started appearing at family dinners with questions about the company. Not aggressive questions, interested ones. Wasn't I working too hard? Didn't I deserve to rest? Had I thought about bringing in a managing partner? Dr. Previtt was our family physician. He treated Walter in the final year. He'd done my annual physicals for 15 years. In January 2023, Craig suggested I see a specialist about some memory concerns he'd noticed. He listed 2 examples. I'd forgotten a lunch date with Claire in November. I'd confused 2 tenants' names in December. I told him I was 67 and busy, and that happened to everyone. He nodded and said he understood and dropped it. 3 months later, Dr. Previtt mentioned almost in passing that Craig had called to share some observations. Just being thorough, Dr. Previtt said. Family members notice things we might miss. I thought nothing of it. I trusted Dr. Previtt the way you trust a doctor you've known for 15 years. Sitting in my kitchen on that Tuesday morning, I understood for the first time that I had been wrong to trust him. I picked up my phone and called my attorney. Beverly Tron had handled Walter's estate and every contract Harlow Property Group had signed in the past 12 years. She answered on the second ring. I told her I needed to see her that afternoon. Something private. She said, come at 3. Before I drove downtown, I called my son James in Portland. Not to tell him everything, not yet, just to hear his voice. He told me about his last day at the firm, about the fishing trip he was planning, about how he couldn't wait to see me Saturday. He sounded so ordinary, so untouched by any of this. I told him I couldn't wait either. At 3 o'clock, I sat across from Beverly and I showed her the recording on Edna's phone and I watched her expression change very carefully. She didn't speak until it finished. Then she asked me to play it again. She leaned back in her chair. The Whitfield Holdings entity, she said, is registered in Delaware. I checked it this morning. Craig is the sole member. It was incorporated 14 months ago. She looked at me. Margaret, this was planned well before anyone mentioned memory concerns to you. Can he do what he's describing? I asked. Legally. Not legally. But the window he's talking about, between a physician's competency assessment and a formal legal challenge, that window is real. If Dr. Chair inchecks, Previtt files a report, and Claire files to assume trust administration, and the money moves before you can challenge it, recovering those funds becomes enormously complicated. Even if you win in court, it could take years. What do I need? 3 things, Beverly said. She held up her fingers one at a time. Evidence of the plan, an independent medical assessment proving competency, and someone who can trace the money movement if it's already started. She reached into her desk and pulled out a business card. Owen Marsh, Private Investigations, Financial Fraud Specialty. I've used him 4 times. He's careful and he's quick. I picked up the card. Can we trust the dinner? The Saturday timeline Craig mentioned? Beverly looked at me. What are you thinking? I told her. She was quiet for a long moment. That's either the smartest thing or the most painful thing I've ever heard a client say, she said. Possibly both. I need to know everything before Saturday, I said. And then I need to be ready. Owen Marsh met me at a diner on South Tryon Street at 7 that evening. He was 60, compact, with the kind of unhurried quality that comes from spending decades watching people who didn't know they were being watched. He ordered water. He didn't write anything down until I'd finished speaking, and then he filled 3 pages in neat, small handwriting. When I was done, he said, "Your son-in-law. Do you think your daughter knows what he's doing?" I've been asking myself that since this morning. What does your gut tell you? That she knows something. I don't know how much. He nodded. That's honest. He flipped to a new page. I'll need access to Whitfield Holdings Incorporation documents, your trust documents, if Beverly can share them. And I'd like Dr. Previtt's professional history. Why his history? He paused. Because this is the second time I've heard Craig Whitfield's name this year. The room went very quiet. The first time, Owen said carefully, was in connection with an elder financial fraud case in Raleigh. A woman named Sylvia Parsons, 73 years old. Her son-in-law arranged a competency filing. Her estate attorney caught it in time. The physician involved was disciplined by the medical board. Craig Whitfield was never charged. He was listed as a consultant. I put both hands flat on the table. He's done this before. Owen looked at me. That's what I'm going to find out. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on top of the covers in the room Walter and I had shared for 31 years, and I stared at the ceiling and thought about Claire. My daughter, born 1979, her father's eyes stubborn in the best way. The one who used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms until she was 12 and then pretended she hadn't. The one who gave a toast at our 40th anniversary that made Walter cry, which he would have denied to anyone who asked. At what point had Craig started on her? How long had he been building the version of me in her mind? The aging mother, the woman losing her edge, the one who needed to be protected. I thought about the lunch date in November, the one I'd allegedly forgotten. I went back through my phone. I found the text thread. Claire had changed the time the morning of, and I'd missed the message. I had it, right there in my phone. I'd never forgotten. I just hadn't seen the updated time. Someone had been building a case, and I had not noticed until it was almost too late. At 5 in the morning, I got up and made coffee and sat in Walter's old chair in the study, and I talked to him the way I've talked to him every morning since he died. I told him what was happening. I told him I was angry and scared and that I needed his steadiness because mine was wearing thin. The window above the desk was going pale with early light. I'm not going to let them take it, I said out loud. Not what you built. Not what we built. Not what we built. I meant it. Wednesday, Owen texted, found the Raleigh filing. Dr. Previtt connected to the case. Medical board complaint 2021 dismissed for insufficient evidence. Previtt received a consulting payment from Whitfield Holdings in February, $14,000. Still looking. Wednesday afternoon, Beverly called. She'd filed a motion to freeze the Harlow Trust pending a competency review. The judge had approved a 48-hour hold, sealed. Craig wouldn't see it until it activated. Wednesday evening, Owen sent a second message, found 3 more. Craig had been involved in similar arrangements in 2018 and 2020. Different physicians, different families, small enough to stay quiet. He wasn't the physician. He wasn't the attorney. He was always the financial consultant in the background. He was a specialist. He had done this to other women, to other families. I sat in Walter's chair and felt something harden in me. Not anger exactly. Clarity. Thursday, I called an independent neurologist at Atrium Health. Dr. Sandra Yee. Beverly had recommended her. I drove downtown and spent 2 hours answering questions and completing assessments and doing word recall exercises and spatial reasoning tests. At the end, Dr. Ho Yee looked at my results and said, "Your cognitive function is well within normal range for a healthy adult. Memory, processing speed, executive function, all strong." She paused. "Who told you this needed to be checked?" "My son-in-law," I said. She wrote something in my file. Thursday evening, Claire called. Her voice was careful in that way I'd grown used to. She asked if I was excited for Saturday. She asked if I'd been feeling okay. She said Craig was looking forward to seeing me. I told her I was looking forward to it too. I kept my voice completely steady. Friday, Owen's full report arrived by secure email. 3 folders. I read them at my kitchen table with coffee going cold beside me. The first, Whitfield Holdings, incorporated 14 months ago. 2 accounts, 1 domestic, 1 offshore in the Cayman Islands. 11 deposits over 12 months. The largest was $80,000. The source was listed as a consulting retainer. The client name was a shell entity Owen had traced through 4 layers to a holding company that shared a registered address with Craig's firm. He had been siphoning preparation funds for over a year. The second, Dr. Previtt's professional history, the Raleigh connection, the 2018 case in Greensboro, the 2020 case in Asheville, the payment from Whitfield Holdings, and a 4th case Owen had found that morning. A woman named Beverly Patterson, 75, whose son-in-law had been investigated in 2022. The competency filing had been submitted. The money had moved before her grandson caught it. She had spent 14 months fighting in court to recover her own estate. She'd gotten most of it back. Dr. Previtt had received $60,000 from that arrangement. The third folder, Craig Whitfield's background, his MBA from Wake Forest, was real. His employment history at the wealth management firm was real, but Owen had found something else. In 2015, Craig had been quietly let go from a firm in Atlanta following an internal audit. No public record, no charges. A former colleague had agreed to speak off the record. He said Craig had been restructuring elderly clients' accounts in ways that benefited a secondary entity he controlled. They let him go rather than press charges because the clients hadn't complained. They hadn't complained because they hadn't understood what had happened. He'd been practicing this for almost a decade. I closed my laptop and sat very still for a while. Then I called Beverly. "Everything ready for tomorrow?" I asked. She said, "Officers confirmed. Judge Preston signed off on the expanded order this afternoon. We have a 12-minute window from when you begin to when the accounts freeze automatically. Owen will run the presentation. I'll be at table 4. And the independent assessment? Dr. Yee's report is filed and notarized. If they try to submit Previtt's assessment Monday, we have grounds to block it immediately. What about Claire?" Beverly was quiet for a moment. "That depends on what she knows, Margaret, and what she's willing to say. I know." After I hung up, I walked out to the back garden. The oak tree was there, the one Walter planted in 1985 when Claire was 6. Its roots had lifted part of the walkway over the years. I'd always meant to have it fixed and never did. Walter said, "Let it be." He said a tree that's growing doesn't apologize for growing. I put my hand on the bark and stood there in the November cold. Saturday came. I dressed slowly. I wore the navy blazer Walter had picked out on our last trip to Asheville, 2 months before his diagnosis. I hadn't worn it since his funeral. I put it on and stood in front of the mirror for a while. Then I went downstairs. Edna was in the kitchen. She'd come early to help with the pre-dinner setup at the restaurant. She looked at me when I walked in. She didn't say anything. She handed me coffee and squeezed my arm. The retirement dinner was at Aria, a private dining room on the 2nd floor. 60 guests. James and his wife had flown in from Portland. Old colleagues of his, friends of mine, 3 of our longest-standing property tenants, 2 members of the Harlow board. Beverly was there. Owen was there, near the AV setup, quiet and unnoticed. Craig was there with Claire. He greeted me at the entrance. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You look wonderful, Margaret. You doing okay?" Big night. I told him I was wonderful. We sat through dinner. James gave a speech. He talked about his father, about growing up in the house on Sycamore Drive, about watching his parents build something from nothing and never making it look like sacrifice even when it was. He talked about me last. He said, "My mother is the most quietly stubborn person I've ever known, and I mean that as the highest compliment I can give a human being." I laughed. So did everyone. Craig laughed too. At 8:45, the MC handed me the microphone for the traditional family toast. I stood up and looked at my son across the room. His face was open and happy and completely unguarded. I thought, James has no idea what is about to happen. Forgive me. I looked at the room. 60 people. People who'd known Walter. People who'd known me. Board members who trusted my decisions for 8 years. I looked at Claire. I said, 38 years ago, Walter and I started Harlow Property Group with 1 building, 1 lease, and a loan that took us 6 years to pay off. We built it the way you built anything worth keeping. Slowly, carefully, by keeping our word. She paused for just a moment. That's the only thing I ever wanted to teach our children. Keep your word. Show up. Don't take what isn't yours. The room was warm and attentive. People were smiling. I said, "This week I learned that someone in this room has been working for over a year to take what isn't theirs." The smiles didn't disappear all at once. They faded unevenly, person by person, as people realized what they were hearing. I nodded toward the back of the room. The screen behind the podium lit up. The first slide was an incorporation document, Whitfield Holdings, LLC, Delaware. Sole member, Craig Whitfield. Incorporated 14 months ago. Several of the board members leaned forward immediately. One of them, a man named Arthur Gaines, who had known Walter since 1987, stood up slightly and then sat back down. Craig said, "Margaret." I said, "Please sit down, Craig." He sat. I said, "Whitfield Holdings has received 11 deposits over 12 months. The source of these funds traces to a consulting retainer paid by an entity that shares a registered address with Craig's employer. This money was preparation capital for a specific plan. The plan was to file a fraudulent competency assessment against me through a physician I trusted, then to have my daughter assume administrative control of the Harlow Trust. Then to move the trust funds $4 million offshore before anyone could file a legal challenge." The room was completely silent. Claire said, "What?" I looked at her. My daughter, in a green dress I'd complimented when she walked in. Her hands were on the table in front of her. I said, "The physician involved is Dr. Previtt." I clicked the slide forward. A payment record appeared. February 14th, $14,000. Whitfield Holdings to a personal account registered to James Previtt, MD. I said, "This is not the first time Dr. Previtt has done this." The next slide showed a timeline. 4 cases. 2018 Greensboro, 2020 Asheville, 2022 Charlotte. Each one followed the same pattern. A financial consultant, a cooperative physician, a competency filing, a trust or estate targeted. Each time the amounts were small enough to stay out of major news coverage. 2 of the 4 women had recovered their funds through legal action. 1 was still in court. 1 had died before the case resolved. I said I was meant to be the 5th. Someone in the room said, "Oh my God," very quietly. The next slide showed Craig's employment history in Atlanta. The 2015 internal audit. The 115 internal audit. The off-record account. 2 board members were now standing. Arthur Gaines had his phone in his hand. Craig pushed back his chair. "This is insane. This is completely." The doors of the private dining room opened. 2 men in dark jackets walked in and a woman who introduced herself as Detective Yolanda Bass, Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department. She said, "Craig Whitfield, we have a warrant for your arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit financial fraud, elder financial abuse, and wire fraud." Craig looked at me. His face did something I hadn't expected. It didn't go angry. It went blank, like a screen turning off. He said, "You have no idea what you've done." I held his gaze. "I have every idea," I said. As they walked him out, Beverly stood from table 4 and addressed the room briefly. She explained the emergency freeze on all Whitfield Holdings accounts, effective at 9 o'clock 2 minutes away. She explained that Dr. Turnamin's Previtt would be facing a formal medical board complaint Monday morning and that a criminal referral was being filed simultaneously. At 9 exactly, Owen's screen updated. A single line in red, "Transfer blocked. Court order in effect." I turned off the microphone. Claire was still sitting at her table. She hadn't moved. Her hands were flat on the tablecloth and her face was the color of old paper. James had crossed the room and was crouching beside her, his hand on her arm, talking quietly to her. She wasn't answering. She was staring at the table. I stepped down from the podium and I walked toward her. The room cleared slowly around us. James looked up at me. He looked like he was trying to find something to say and couldn't. I put my hand on his shoulder. "Give us a minute, sweetheart." He stood and stepped back. I sat down next to Claire. She still wasn't looking at me. Her throat moved. She said, "I didn't know about the other women." I said, "I know." She said, "He told me you were declining. He showed me examples. He said he was worried about you. He said we needed to protect you before you made a decision that hurt the company or yourself." "Did you believe him?" She closed her eyes. I wanted to. It was easier than the alternative. What was the alternative? That my mother was fine and my husband was lying to me. We sat in silence for a moment. She said, "I signed a document in September. He said it was a protective trust amendment. He said it was standard for women your age who ran family businesses." I didn't read it carefully. "I signed it." I said, "I know. Beverly found it." Claire looked up finally. Her eyes were red. "Did you know I knew anything?" I said, "I knew you knew something." I didn't know how much. I still don't, entirely. She said, I'm not stupid. I know you're not. I wanted to believe him because believing him meant you needed me. And you've never needed me, Mom. You've never needed anyone. You've never needed anyone. I looked at my daughter, 53 years old, beautiful, sitting in a green dress in a restaurant with her husband being arrested in the lobby downstairs. And still, under all of it, the same thing she'd been saying in 100 different ways for 30 years. I said, I have always needed you. I just never learned how to say it while your father was alive because he was so good at saying it for both of us. And after he was gone, I was so busy not falling apart that I forgot to let you see me. She started crying, the kind of crying that's been stored up for a while. I didn't help her stop. I just sat there next to her and let it happen. The weeks after were strange and long. Craig's bail hearing was Monday. He was released on $120,000 and ordered to surrender his passport. His attorney filed an immediate motion to suppress the recording Edna had made. Beverly had been expecting it. The motion was denied. The recording was legal under North Carolina's one-party consent law, and Edna had been present in the home lawfully as an employee. Dr. Previtt was suspended from practice pending investigation. He did not contest it. Owen told me later that Previtt had been cooperative almost immediately, which suggested he'd been waiting for this to catch up with him for some time. The Charlotte Observer ran a small item on page 6. I declined to comment. James called every day for 2 weeks. He didn't ask questions. He just called and we talked about ordinary things, which was exactly what I needed. Claire moved out of the house she'd shared with Craig and into a short-term rental in the Myers Park neighborhood. She called me on the 3rd day. Not to talk about Craig. To ask if she could come over for dinner. She came on a Thursday. Edna made chicken soup because Edna has always believed chicken soup fixes things that nothing else reaches. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd sat the morning I first heard Edna's recording and felt the cold thing settle in my chest. We talked for 4 hours. We didn't solve anything, but we started. She said at one point, I blocked every instinct I had because he made me doubt the instincts. He'd say, you're being protective of her, it's natural, but you have to think rationally. He used my love for you to make me betray you. And I let him. I said, he was practiced at it. This wasn't your failure. It was his design. She said, that doesn't make me feel better about the part I played. I said, it shouldn't, but it's still true. 6 months later, in May, Craig was sentenced on 3 federal counts, 10 years, minimum 8 before parole eligibility. His attorney argued he'd been acting under financial duress. He'd been over-leveraged on several private investments and had been facing margin calls since 2022. The judge was unimpressed. He said, financial pressure does not license the predatory targeting of elderly women. The victims in the cases you engineered did not create your debt. They were chosen because they were vulnerable and trusted you. I sat in the courtroom and listened. Craig looked at me once, near the end. I didn't look away. Dr. Previtt's criminal case was still pending at sentencing, but the medical board had already acted. His license was permanently revoked. 2 of the 4 previous victims filed civil suits. In a pre-trial deposition, Previtt said he'd told himself the families involved had the patient's best interests at heart. He said he'd convinced himself the assessments were essentially accurate, even if they weren't technically documented. He said he'd been well paid for convenience. The depositions were public record. I read them on a Sunday morning at Walter's desk and felt very tired. Harlow Property Group was fine. Better than fine. I brought in a second property manager in the spring, promoted our contracts coordinator to operations director, restructured 2 leases that had been underperforming. The board met in March and voted to add 2 independent directors. Arthur Gaines sent me a handwritten note afterward that said simply, Walter would have been proud. I put it on the desk next to Walter's photograph. The independent assessment from Dr. Yee was submitted to the court in January as part of the criminal proceedings. Her findings were entered into the record. No cognitive impairment, no decline, no basis for any competency challenge. I was 67 years old. I had built and protected a $9 million company. I had survived my husband's death and 8 years of running everything alone and a year of being slowly, carefully undermined by someone sitting at my dinner table. I did not feel victorious. I felt wrung out and grateful and very, very tired. James flew in for Thanksgiving. He helped me rake the back garden, and we didn't talk about Craig or the trial or any of it. He told me about the boat he was planning to buy. I told him about the new operations director and the lease renegotiations. We ate dinner with Edna and her husband, which had become our tradition since Walter died. At one point, James looked at me across the table and said, "Mom, are you okay? Actually okay?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "I'm going to be. Give me until spring." He said, "Deal." Claire came for Christmas. She brought wine and helped me put up the wreath that had been her tradition since she moved out in her 20s. We hung it together. She stepped back and looked at it and said, "Same as always." And I said, "Something should be." She'd started therapy in October. She talked about it openly in a way that surprised me, in a good way. She said the therapist had helped her understand that she'd spent years reading my self-sufficiency as rejection, that every time I'd handled something alone, she'd heard, "I don't need you." She'd heard it so often and so long that when Craig offered her a version of the story where I did need her, where I needed her protection, her control, her help, she'd wanted it to be true. She said, "I was so hungry to matter to you that I let someone use that hunger as a lever." I said, "You've always mattered to me. I am sorry you didn't know that." She said, "I'm sorry I didn't fight harder to find out." We were quiet for a while. She said, "What do we do now?" I said, "We do what your father always did. We start from where we are and we build carefully." She nodded. In March, she took a position at a nonprofit doing financial counseling for seniors. She called me the first Friday after she started and told me about a client, a woman in her 70s who'd been targeted by a home equity scam. She'd helped the woman understand the documents she'd been given and flagged them for a legal review before anything went through. She caught it, Claire said, because someone explained it to her. I could hear something in my daughter's voice that had been missing for a long time. Something steady. I said, "That's good work." She said, "Yeah, I think it might be." 1 year after that Saturday dinner, I sat in Walter's chair in the study on a November morning. The oak tree in the back garden had gone bare again. It did that every year, and every year I forgot how bare it got until it happened, and then I remembered. I'd gotten a letter the week before from Beverly Patterson, one of the women in the previous cases Owen had documented. She'd heard about my case through the civil proceedings. She wrote 3 pages. She described what it had felt like to watch her money disappear and spend years fighting to get it back. She described what it had felt like to be told she was incompetent by a doctor she'd trusted. She described her granddaughter who had fought for her and how that had changed something between them permanently and for the better. At the end of the letter, she said, "I'm glad you caught it. I'm glad you fought. I'm sorry it happened to you. I'm glad we're both still here to talk about it." I wrote back. It took me 4 drafts. Claire called that evening. She asked how I was. We talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular. Her new clients, a property question she had, a book she thought I'd like. Before she hung up, she said, "Hey, Mom." I said, "Yes." She said, "Thank you for not giving up on me." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "I was never going to give up on you. I just needed to save us both first." She laughed, a real laugh, the kind her father used to call contagious. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet. The study was the same as it always was. Walter's photograph on the desk, the window going dark, the oak tree outside, bare branches reaching up into the November sky, roots still lifting the walkway after 40 years. Growing doesn't apologize for growing. I had $4 million in a trust, and a company worth $9 million, and a daughter I was slowly learning to talk to, and a son who called every Sunday, and a housekeeper who had saved my life by staying late to finish the laundry. And I had this, the knowledge that someone tried to take everything I'd built and didn't. Not because I was powerful, because I paid attention, because I asked for help, Because Edna trusted me enough to lock those car doors and say, "Margaret, I need you to listen. If you are watching this and you have someone in your life who makes you doubt your own memory, your own competence, your own worth, please hear me. Document everything. Trust the people who have been with you for years, not the people who arrive with plans. And if someone you love is being slowly, quietly diminished, say something. Don't wait until you're sure. Say something." Walter used to say, "The cost of speaking up is always less than the cost of staying silent." He was right about most things. He was especially right about that. Thank you for being here with me. If this story sat with you in any way, if it made you think about trust, or family, or the quiet courage it takes to protect what you've built, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear it. And I'd love to know, if you were sitting in that retirement dinner and someone handed you a microphone, would you have the courage to tell the truth? Let me know in the comments. I read everyone. I've spent a lot of time since that November thinking about what actually saved me. It wasn't the attorney, it wasn't the investigator, it wasn't even the evidence, as important as all of that was. What saved me was a woman who stayed late to finish the laundry and had the courage to say something when she wasn't sure anyone would believe her. Edna had worked in my home for 18 years. She knew where I kept the spare key and how I took my coffee and which drawer I put Walter's letters in. She also knew, the way people who've watched you for a long time know things, that what she'd overheard didn't fit. It didn't fit the Margaret she knew. So she said something. That's the whole story, underneath all the rest of it. Someone paid attention and told the truth, and because she did, I had 4 days instead of 0. I think about Craig a lot. Not with bitterness anymore, mostly with something closer to exhaustion and pity. He was skilled at what he did. He'd been doing it for nearly a decade across multiple states, multiple families, multiple women who had spent their lives building something and trusted the wrong person at the wrong moment. He was good at reading what people wanted and giving them a version of it. What Claire wanted was to matter to me. He handed her a story where she got to be my protector, my rescuer, the one I finally needed. He used her love as a tool, and she let him because she was hungry for something I hadn't known to give her. That's the part I sit with the longest. Not what Craig did, what I didn't do. I raised 2 children while running a company, and I told myself I was doing it for them, for their future, for the legacy Walter and I had built together. And I was. But somewhere in all that building, I forgot that presence is not the same as provision. I gave my children financial security and a solid inheritance, and a mother who showed up to every graduation. What I didn't give Claire, not consistently, not in the language she needed, was the simple knowledge that she was wanted there, that I needed her, not her labor or her loyalty, just her. Craig exploited a crack that I had made. That's the hardest truth of this whole year. There's a thing I've come to believe about the way consequences work, and it has nothing to do with luck or fate or any invisible force keeping score. It's simpler and colder than that. The choices we make compound. Craig made 100 small dishonest choices over a decade, and they compounded into federal charges and a decade in prison. I made 100 small distracted choices over 30 years, and they compounded into a daughter who was so desperate to feel seen by me that she was vulnerable to a man who offered her a counterfeit version of it. Neither of us set out to cause the damage we caused it anyway. What I know now is that integrity isn't one decision made under pressure. It's all the small ones made when nothing is at stake yet. And presence isn't a grand gesture. It's the phone call you make when you're tired. It's saying, "I need you," when you've spent your whole life saying, "I'm fine." Claire is doing good work now. She catches the things that other people miss, and she explains them clearly to people who are frightened and confused and grateful. She got that from somewhere. I'd like to think she got it from both of us, from Walter's patience and from whatever stubbornness I managed to pass down without meaning to. She's building something. Not the same thing I built, but something solid and her own. That's enough. That's more than enough.